Is the resurrection of Jesus refutable? Let's just look at the facts. What's the evidence that the tomb Jesus was buried in was discovered empty by a group of women on the Sunday following the crucifixion? Well, first, the resurrection was preached in the same city where Jesus had been arrested, flogged, tortured, crucified, and buried in. The disciples did not go to some obscure place where no one had heard of Jesus to begin preaching about the resurrection. Instead, they began preaching in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus died. They couldn't have done this if Jesus was still in the tomb. Second, remember the Jewish leaders who opposed Jesus? Matthew 28:11-15 says, the Roman guards came and told the Jewish leaders that the tomb was empty. Then the Jewish leaders came up with this plan to pay the Roman guards to tell the story that the disciples stole the body. These Jewish leaders here are admitting the significant truth that the tomb was empty, and they attempted to explain it away. Why would they admit the tomb was empty unless the evidence was too strong to be denied? Third, the tomb was discovered empty by women. Why is this important? Well, because the testimony of women in the first century Jewish culture was considered worthless. The fact that despised women whose testimony was deemed worthless were the chief witnesses to the empty tomb can only be plausibly explained if they actually were the discoverers of the empty tomb. The fact that women's testimonies were even written down and have survived all this time is incredible. Next, there is the evidence that Jesus' disciples had real experiences with the one whom they believed was the risen Christ. And this one's hard to dispute because we have testimony of the original disciples themselves saying they saw Jesus alive. Now, I realize that just because the disciples think they saw Jesus doesn't automatically mean they did. I see three possible alternatives here. They were either lying, hallucinating, or they saw Jesus alive. Which one of these is most likely? Were they lying? Well, in this view, the disciples knew that Jesus hadn't really risen, but they made up the story about the resurrection. If that's the case, why did 10 of the disciples willingly die as martyrs for their belief in the resurrection? People will often die for a lie that they believe is the truth. But if Jesus didn't rise and they knew it, they wouldn't have just been dying for a lie they mistakenly believed was true. They would have been dying for a lie they knew was a lie. And let me ask you, would you die for that? Were they hallucinating? Guys, the disciples record eating and drinking with Jesus, as well as touching him. This cannot be done with hallucinations. Second, it is highly unlikely that all of them would have had the same hallucination. Think about this. All 500 plus eyewitnesses hallucinated? Hallucinations are highly individual, not group projections. Furthermore, the hallucination theory cannot explain the conversion of Paul 3 years later. I mean, was Paul, the Christian killer, so hoping to see the resurrected Jesus that his mind invented the appearance as well? Since the disciples couldn't have been lying and they weren't hallucinating, we only have one possible explanation left. The disciples believed they had seen the risen Jesus because they really saw the risen Jesus. This is the compelling testimony of the truth of the resurrection of Jesus. Paul says, go ask these people who saw the resurrected Christ. There are not a handful of the self-deluded souls. There are literally hundreds who saw Jesus alive with their own eyes. They knew Jesus rose from death, and therefore we can know the same. So Christians, stop saying that Jesus lives because he lives in your hearts. He lives because he rose from death and sits at the right hand of God, and he's coming soon. And based on the evidence, we stand firmly on this claim, the claim that our faith hinges on.